Okay, if we could, like I said, we're running behind schedule. We have a hard stop on the next panel because we're going to be having a fireside chat between myself and John Podesta. And I'm going to leave that up to Phillip Brown of the Congressional Research Service to make that hard stop and to introduce the next panel, which concerns the implementation and implications of the Inflation Reduction Act. Come on up.
On August 16th, 2022, President Biden's signature enacted Public Law 117-169, which is commonly known as the Inflation Reduction Act. Using expedited budget reconciliation procedures that require only a simple Senate majority, the bill passed the Senate by a vote of 51-50, with Vice President Harris serving as the President of the Senate, casting the tie-breaking vote. Since enactment, federal agencies have been executing numerous programs authorized and funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. For example, the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office has committed funding of more than $30 billion to 20-plus projects, including 2 projects located here in the state of Pennsylvania. One, a manufacturing facility for utility-scale battery energy storage systems in Turtle Creek, and a plastics recycling project located in Erie. The IRA also includes tax incentives for renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and other low-carbon technologies, as well as funding assistance programs such as the methane emissions reduction program that was discussed during yesterday's panel about abandoned and orphan wells, and several other initiatives, including requirements for federal oil and gas leasing. So over the last 2 years, how has the IRA affected investment flows, technology development, project development, electricity markets, and even geopolitics? What is working well, and what provisions perhaps require some further reevaluation at this time? So to address these questions, I am joined by a panel of experts to share their views about the implementation and implications of the Inflation Reduction Act. On the panel we have Landon Derentz, Senior Director and Richard Morningstar Chair for Global Energy Security at the Atlantic Council, R.J. Johnston, Senior Director of Research at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Director of the Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment and the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So each presenter will provide remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with a hard stop at 11. So, Landon, you're up first. The floor is yours.
Hey, Phillip, I really appreciate it. Great to be here. Andrew, it's wonderful to actually make this happen, and I want to add the hospitality and the welcome by all the local communities has been incredible as well. Landon Derentz with the Atlantic Council, working in international foreign policy think tank, come to this from many years in the U.S. government at the Department of Energy, the Department of State, and the White House. Actually served with Andrew from 2018-2019 timeframe as Director for Energy and the National Security Council. Steve is now in a similar role, although it takes on new manifestations on different administrations. Look, I have 2 goals today. I have a presentation with 2 sets of slides, and we can go ahead and go to the next set of slides. I want to provide a quantitative baseline, just of thinking about where some of the investment flows have originated in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then maybe take on a little bit of the international perspective from where I sit at the Atlantic Council, some of the international travel, and how people are thinking about clean energy investment globally. Just to compare it. I mean, ultimately, it's interesting coming off of dinner last night, being at the Drake well, having oil on the mind, and then I'm going to be the guy who briefs you on clean energy, but I think Michael Cohen just did a good job taking away some of the constraints on that. Look, policy has implications, and if we look back in 2015 and we look at the crude export ban, we see tremendous growth in U.S. Conventional energy exports. The Inflation Reduction Act is a tsunami of investment composed of tax credits, grants, loans, loan guarantees that in an aggregate cocktail are providing a lot of momentum behind clean tech and climate-friendly technologies. Now, the IRA was put into law in July 2022, and I haven't done a tremendous much of this analysis, so I am paying patronage to the Rhodium Group and MIT for some of the really great analysis that you should read the reports on independently at some point, because they've really aggregated this data and are thinking through these numbers in a really cohesive manner. It's important when we look at a gas-rich economy and a place that has the opportunity here to seize growth in the conventional energy space, but also have a little bit of a forward perspective in terms of where energy trends are headed. And so I think, for a community that has seen the rise and fall of an industry in the oil sector, this takes on even maybe a little bit more momentum. The way the Rhodium Group study is broken down, it really talks about three core areas: manufacturing, which is investment in facilities and equipment; energy and technology, which is really a factor of deployment, the supply side; and then retail, which often is the purchase and installation of different products. Think EVs or heat pumps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the retail side. The dotted line you see up there is actually IEA's assessment of upstream oil and gas and investment in North America. I'm not counting every F-150 that's sold. I'm not counting retail gasoline sales. So I think we can, numbers have an impact. But I think the manufacturing and energy technology aspects of what is up on the slide are actually pretty robust. And I just want to highlight a few general factors here. Number one, in the manufacturing and deployment side, comparing the 2 years preceding passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the 2 years subsequent to the passage, we saw a nearly $200 billion increase from $288 billion to $493 billion in those two sectors. So something is stimulating change, and that's something being an aspect of policy here in the credits and the business certainty that the tax environment is being provided from the Inflation Reduction Act. Manufacturing is to me, as a former policymaker, perhaps the most interesting, because that's where we start talking about critical components, and I think we'll be a part of the conversation with Phillip later about why we should care and how we should prioritize investment. That's talking about batteries, critical minerals, aspects of EV and storage supply chains that I think are really kind of the next generation of debate in terms of global geopolitical trends. And so we're seeing a 305% comparative time frame increase in terms of investment in those sectors, which I think is tremendous and honestly a very specific target aspect of the legislation originally. In the manufacturing and in the manufacturing space, we're also seeing growth in other segments. For example, solar saw a 10x growth from just under $1 billion to about $10 billion, and electrolyzers and some of the other technologies that have small baselines are seeing, at a percentage scale, very tremendous growth, but still they're nascent industries. So they're being inspired, and we're thinking through a much more comprehensive package of where we can invest in what technologies in pursuit of development of a clean energy sector in the United States. But I think that the big ones, the big takeaways that are having immediate impact are most certainly the battery sector and to some degree, elements of critical minerals and supply chains that, I think Steve even talked about the adversaries and how we're dealing with leveraging those relationships. On the energy and technology deployment base, we're also seeing growth. Frankly, the story is growth across the board for the most part, with the exception of wind. And that's up 43%, so it's not the magnitudes of a percentage increase of 305, but on a dollar basis, it's still quite tremendous. A lot of those are carryovers of prior production tax credits and investment tax credits, frankly, tax credits that were inspired right after the crude export ban was lifted nearly a decade ago. And so some of those continue, and I think that we're seeing a very natural scale of progression in that space and development of those technologies. This is a mature as they scale in general, as the costs come down affiliated with PV solar in particular, but also some degree wind. I will say wind is under a little bit more fatigue given permitting constraints and regulatory challenges, siting restrictions. It is an industry that has a tremendous amount of potential in terms of its contribution to our power sector, but I think it is definitely lagging behind in the current environment for non-IRA related matters. And obviously, a big conversation in Washington, D.C. right now in our Great Old Echo Chamber is in fact permitting reform. One aspect of the deployment phase that I think is maybe perhaps underappreciated is the aspects of growth in some of these emerging technologies. So, there's tax incentives for carbon management, for example, and sequestration. There's targets for hydrogen growth, which is really intended to help in hard to abate sectors in the industrial economy, and some pretty significant growth in sustainable aviation fuel. Now, they're all coming from very, very meager baselines, but it's still interesting to see where some investment's going. I think, in my opinion, in particular on the hydrogen space, it is also an area that's perhaps going to be fatigued by policy as Treasury's weighing guidance on how we think through additionality to the grid, the timing and matching components of how you're accounting for when you take the electricity produced from a clean energy resource and use it through electrolysis to make the hydrogen. All of the components of that are going to have an ability to scale. How strict we are and how limiting we create the frameworks around that, which is something the White House and Treasury are working on, will have a direct correlation to the scale of that industry in the front end. And so we're still waiting to see that guidance. There's the initial rules, the advisory rules that came out from Treasury were very comparatively restrictive. We're expecting a loosening of those rules, but it's still unclear if that's going to see tremendous growth. But it is interesting to note overall the fact that the IRA is inspiring a new outlook in terms of how we can pursue different technologies that haven't matured yet in the economy. Just one more point here in terms of the oil and gas versus clean energy spend. I think we're looking at a point in the U.S. Where we are the world's #1 natural gas exporter, or #1 producer of oil and gas in general. And I don't know that these are zero sum as people feel. There's a lot of new industries coming on. I'm seeing a tremendous demand from the data center side. We just watched some new nuclear being set up, commitments from Google with SMRs. We're seeing commitments from Microsoft with bringing back 3 Mile Island. I mean, these are real constraints in terms of how much power we're putting on the market. And so I would look at these as complementary and also just an area where we need to have discipline to think through how the U.S. can be most competitive vis-a-vis global adversaries and a security standpoint and economics and competitiveness on a general commercial standpoint. Go to the next slide. So this slide breaks down investment trends based on the International Energy Agency's investment outlook that comes out annually. And I think the critical point here is we've seen continued growth in clean energy investment across the board. I actually held a constant on the larger graph. The power sector can be empowering both the natural gas power plants and clean electrons from renewables. But I think for me, it's really particularly important that we hold for that and just look at what the supply inputs are from the clean energy side vis-a-vis the conventional fossil without CCS. And the truth is, you see a little bit of dip in the oil and gas sector, which is the economics of COVID, really, but pretty strong. And I think even Michael Cohen talking about this, even in a net zero scenario where you're in 2030, 2040, you still have tremendous demand for fossil energy. So I think investment's going to continue. We'd expect that to be the case. Globally, there's an incentive. I think this is important to think about. America is resource rich. We have a lot of energy, a lot of oil and gas. We have an abundance of natural resources that we can tap, including in the clean energy economy. Not everybody is that fortunate. I just came back from Copenhagen last week. They're resource poor, right? And so energy security and the competitiveness and economics take on a different facet. Yes, US LNG has been a savior to the German economy and helped out Europe in a time of tremendous need in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere. That said, their energy prices are still 3x plus what they are here domestically in the US because of very cost-effective energy inputs that we have, principally in the back of natural gas. And so they're incentivized to find different means to be able to achieve their competitiveness and security. And so I think my takeaway and why I bring this last wrap up here is China's the same way, right? You have an economy of 1.4 billion people. You only produce a very small fraction, frankly, very much like the United States did in 2004, 2005 time frame, importing around 12 million barrels of oil a day. So you have an economic dependence that you're trying to wean yourself from. On top of that, you're trying to create jobs, and the clean energy investments that China is making are intended to do that, right? It's about stability, economic stability and economic opportunity for your population. It's about power access and reliable access to power, so you have a stable political economy, and I think it's ultimately also an energy security aspect. You have to imagine if there was a global conflict between the United States and China, the Straits of Malacca and other bottlenecks begin to take on more importance, and I think that these countries are aware of it. So whether you're Europe, who's just seeking to be competitive, or you're China, who has both domestic and international imperatives, there's a reason why we're going to continue to see investment in the clean energy architecture. So we should absolutely be seizing on the competitiveness and the ability that natural gas in the United States provides us to have a competitive edge today. We also need to be cognizant of some of the trend lines for the future, because ultimately the clean energy economy has a lot of non-economic motivators globally as well. So with that, I'll stop. Phillip, the floor is back to you.
Okay, Landon, thanks very much. So next we have RJ Johnston. RJ, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I may stand here just so I can see my own slides. I'll try not to fall off the stage as much as possible. I'll just follow up on Landon and some of his comments with the IRA and a bit of a forward look. It's nice to see familiar faces here and great to visit this wonderful museum. We can go ahead to the next slide. So just a little bit about our center at Columbia University. We're an energy policy think tank set within Columbia. We're focused on trying to provide timely but rigorous research, independent evidence-based research for policymakers and industry leaders and civil society leaders and students and others, and from a very interdisciplinary methodology here. Next slide. So, like Landon, I share the enthusiasm for the Rhodium Group data, and I use some of it as well here, but from a different angle. It's less about where the spending is going, which I think Landon covered very well, and a little bit more about the geographic distribution. And I think what you can see here is some significant clusters of where IRA spending has gone. Certainly California, US Gulf Coast, Midwest, and to some degree, kind of Mid-Atlantic region here as well. Some pretty big blank spots on the map, however. And I think one of the political challenges for the IRA is how do you actually direct the spending to some of the regions like the Midwest, the Rockies, Pacific Northwest that are not getting as much investment. So that's one thing to think about, the political challenges that go with that. Second thing to consider here, building Landon's point, is that if you look at those yellow and orange dots, it's a lot of solar and a lot of storage, right? Those are technologies that have a proven business model, right? And a lot of this other stuff is still, you're trying, from a deployment perspective, much earlier stage. So we're not seeing the actual projects in the ground, even though the incentives are available. That will happen over time, but it's a slower process. Next slide, please. So I think this makes the point a little bit even more clearly, right? That if you look at the last few quarters, this is just the manufacturing side. Not all the deployment of solar that we saw in the previous slide. A lot of big blue circles there indicating the battery investments. Again, not surprising, clustered in the auto-producing region, the Rust Belt, but also down in the southeast. And that's why you hear a lot of talk about, well, will Trump repeal the IRA? If you look at some of the states that are going to be red states that have strong Republican support, they are benefiting from some of these projects, which will certainly add complexity to any potential repeal. We might be more likely to perhaps get a reform versus a repeal, particularly tightening some of the Buy America provisions, putting further limits on China-linked investment, and maybe shifting away from some of the sectors like EVs and wind more towards things like hydrogen, nuclear, critical minerals. We can think about that as well. But again, this is not a full national story. It's very concentrated in particular regions. Next slide. Okay, so what are my key takeaways here? Some of these I mentioned already. I think when we look at the scale of the deployment around solar and storage, that's obviously having big implications for the natural gas market, which we care about here in Pennsylvania. It's not displacing natural gas, but it's changing the power mix a little bit, right? That gas as a partner to renewables certainly works well in the U.S. electricity market. We are seeing that manufacturing investment really dominated by three regions, Rust Belt, U.S. Gulf Coast, and southeastern U.S. And how do you get that political support for continuing the IRA if other regions are not getting the same kinds of benefits? Now, one thing that explains that regional disparity is that the Inflation Reduction Act excuse me, included very specific incentives to direct investment towards communities that either had coal assets that were being phased out, or to communities that had internal combustion engine auto manufacturing assets as well. So that was an additional layer of incentive on top of the production tax credits, investment tax credits, loans, grants, etc., to shift investment towards those regions. Now, I also think there's a big question here, which Landon referred to, which is when you look at things like sustainable aviation fuel, clean hydrogen, critical minerals, and nuclear, there's all kinds of incentives in the IRA, but how do you move them to actual projects? Those projects have a lot more technology risk, a lot more project risk, and a less clear private sector financial model. Financing a nuclear power plant or a lithium mine is a lot more complicated than financing a solar project, right? So that's something we need to solve on, and we're working on quite a bit at Columbia in terms of how do you unlock the private sector capital to go after these more early stage technologies or more capital intensive technologies. Okay, another point to consider here is what have we not seen yet in the IRA and what could come next? Well, my own view is that from an industrial policy perspective, we're just kind of at the beginning of a cycle, a mega cycle of government intervention and industrial policy in clean energy, in semiconductors, and other critical supply chains. I mentioned with Trump, if he wins, we might see stronger restrictions on so-called foreign entities of concern, anything that's linked to China or Russia specifically. We'll probably see stronger CFIUS review, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That would look at potential inbound acquisitions by foreign companies of U.S. technology firms or energy firms. And I think that the shift there is that that's not new. We've always had those foreign investment reviews, but they're going to get tougher. Not just looking for potential buyers that are owned by Chinese entities, but are even linked to Chinese entities. So Trump's talking about Mexico, for example, and EV factories there that might have a Chinese investor or a Chinese partnership of some kind, but could be subject to these trade restrictions and foreign investment decisions. Landon mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which really speaks to the kind of merger of trade policy and climate policy. And if we're going to be investing heavily in decarbonizing our industry, and China is not doing that at the same pace, how do we put in barriers at the border to make sure we protect the investments we're making and the additional costs we're accruing for our domestic manufacturing firms? So how do we align with Europe on something like that? There's a Democratic plan which would include carbon pricing and a Republican plan which would not. But interestingly, both parties seem to agree that there's value in having some kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism to protect U.S. manufacturing. Okay, now what about other types of investment? When we talk about what's in the IRA, we're mostly talking about tax credits and loans and loan guarantees, but that's all on sort of the debt side. We're starting to hear more about equity-based investment, right? And you think about all the talk about strategic sectors, and it's worth thinking, well, what is the actual definition of a strategic sector? I won't bore you with all the academic definitions, but the one I like the most is the idea that a strategic sector is a sector that the government decides is too important to leave the private sector or to the market. That could cover a lot of territory potentially. So I think what we're seeing is a temptation for the government to step in even further, not just with debt, but actually taking ownership stakes in clean energy projects. We might see that in critical minerals and minerals processing, We might see that in the nuclear sector, and we're seeing other countries like the UK and Canada already. And I think especially if Harris wins, that'll be something to watch quite closely. And I think we'll also see additional foreign policy around this. It's obviously not a great time for free trade agreements, but we are seeing sector-level cooperation on things like critical minerals with the Mineral Security Partnership. This is sort of the friend-shoring idea. We can't do everything on our own when it comes to clean energy. So which group of allies do we work with on things like critical minerals or supply chains or batteries, etc.? Next slide. I think this is the last one for me. Just very briefly, Landon talked a little bit about the international responses here as well. And what's interesting, you think about the genesis of the Inflation Reduction Act in many ways was a response to China's Made in 2025 plan, which was their big industrial policy plan they launched in 2015, which has been quite successful in helping them grow market share and leadership in things like minerals processing and electric vehicles. So Made in China 2025 led to the IRA, and now the IRA is leading to industrial policy response in places like Japan and the European Union. The EU Green New Deal, the Japan Green Transformation Plan. And it raises the question of, and I'll conclude with this, are we headed to a pattern of cooperation or competition in industrial policy? Is it really about friend-shoring and the US working with Europeans, the Canadians, Mexico, Latin America, Japan, Korea, or is it more a go-it-alone your approach? And when you look at these competing industrial policies, there's a risk of kind of a every nation for itself approach, an industrial subsidy race, which could be very damaging for everybody potentially. And then what about the countries that are not the big superpowers? What about the middle powers? Your Australias, your Koreas, countries like that, Brazil, that generally want to trade with the US and China equally. And then what about the emerging economies, right? Where do they fit into this new industrial policy landscape? So I'd say to summarize, there's kind of three paths forward here. And again, like Michael Cohen said, there's no crystal ball here, but just scenarios. I think the most likely path we're on is that we have an OECD type of trading bloc focused on common industrial policy, green the economy, secure supply chains, US, Europe, Canada, Korea, Japan, etc. And that's really at the sectoral level and maybe some joint financing of these clean energy projects. The second path would be more that mercantilist path, right? Every nation for itself, as my old boss, Ian Bremer, likes to say, where you have a much more of an industrial policy arms race, which would involve continuing escalation in industrial policy interventions. I think the least likely path is a return to globalization, right? We had 30 years probably of unconstrained expansion of markets, of free trade, globalization, the 80s, the 90s, the first decade of the 2000s. Probably started to come to the end around the time the Trans-Pacific Partnership fell apart, Trump election, Brexit, things like that. Are we now looking at another 30 years cycle, except this time it's more focused on protectionism, trade conflict, industrial policy, including these clean energy spaces? So time will tell, but I will leave it with that and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, RJ. Really good information. So Diana, I'd like to welcome you to the stage, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks.
Would you like to use that? Yeah.
I can see my slides and see all of you. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for organizing all of this. This has been really it was a great day yesterday. It's a great day today also. And I'd like to take a little bit of a different tack than the past three speakers. I'd like to say that if contradiction in terms were created by an oxymoron, the oxymoron would be the Inflation Reduction Act. The act increased inflation and reduced our strength against China. The IRA does the opposite of what it said it would do, and the best we could do, I would like to argue, is get rid of it. Not that I think this is going to happen, because in Washington, even if you bet against a bill passing or a bill getting repealed, you're more likely to win than if you bet in favor of it, because we have gridlock, and gridlock was set up for a purpose, to stop bad things happening. It often stops good things happening. You might recall that President Trump was elected in 2016 on a platform of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. Well, he muted a lot of the most damaging provisions of the Affordable Care Act, but the law is still with us. And if he were to be elected again, I think the same thing would probably happen. Well, we've heard a lot today about how spending on green energy has gone up. I mean, we've heard from 3 speakers, we've had very, very convincing charts, beautiful charts, about how spending on clean energy has gone up. But what we haven't heard is, first of all, what clean energy, how much electricity clean energy is producing as a share of the total, point 1. And point 2, at what cost? And those are both crucial in an economy. And I'd like to say that the Inflation Reduction Act raises the cost of electricity. So we might get 100% investment in clean energy. But then what if our electricity prices double or triple? We're not better off. So I passed out a chart of residential electricity prices and gasoline prices by state. I passed it out rather than putting it up here. First of all, because the letters are very small. And secondly, because I wanted you to be able to take it away with you. And you could even check it in case you don't believe my numbers. But basically what it shows is that the top 10 states in terms of electricity prices all have what's called renewable portfolio standards. They all require a certain share of their electricity to be made with renewables, except one. That one is Alaska, and it has expensive electricity prices because it has a few people scattered over a very wide area, and it's difficult to provide electricity in those circumstances, and it is not connected with the lower 48. Then if you look at the bottom 10 states in terms of electricity prices, they do not have renewable portfolio standards. They don't have regional transmission organizations, which I will argue later also raise the price of electricity. With one exception. That one exception is Washington State, which benefits from hydropower, which is relatively inexpensive. Washington State is a bit like Norway. It has a lot of water, and that gives renewable energy at a low cost. So the Inflation Reduction Act, by subsidizing a lot of these renewables and wind, is going to drive up prices of electricity. And the reason for that is that it is more difficult to provide intermittent power. It's more difficult to provide electricity from intermittent power. This is a wind farm that cycles on and off, or an array of solar panels, because you have to have a backup with it. And it's more expensive to coordinate the natural gas power plant going on, which is most usually used as a peaker plant, because you can't turn on and off a nuclear power plant, and you can't really turn on and off a coal-fired power plant. So you're using these natural gas peaker plants that go on and off when the wind stops blowing, or when the sun isn't shining. And there's also batteries, of course, for the solar panels, which are expensive in themselves. And that's more expensive than running that natural gas power plant continuously, especially since natural gas prices are very low. They're about $2.20 per million BTUs. We have a lot of natural gas. So it's basically more expensive. So the IRA raises electricity prices. Plus, it makes us depend on China, point number 2. And I included in your package an op-ed that I wrote on how Biden's energy policies favor China against Pittsburgh. That was published in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette last spring. The bottom line is that China still makes a lot of the batteries for EVs. It produces 80% of the world's batteries. It makes a lot of components for renewables. It has about 7 of the largest 10 solar power plant makers, 7 of the largest 10 wind turbine makers. So doing the IRA makes us more dependent on China. And why does this matter? Well, politics is full of surprises. No one would have guessed that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, or that Iranian-backed Hamas was going to invade Israel. But energy policy should not be a surprise. Our energy should be resilient, and it should be free from dependence on countries that are not friendly to us. So it's fine having the Keystone XL pipeline. Canada is friendly to us. We get the sour crude from Canada. We refine in our refineries. We send it back to them in terms of gasoline. You know, that's great. But depending on China for things like components of our renewables, batteries for our EVs, electric vehicles that can be stopped from remote. And if you don't think they can be stopped from remote, you should look at OnStar. OnStar advertises if you subscribe to OnStar, GM's OnStar, then if your car gets stolen, they can stop it from remote. And I can assure you, if GM can stop a gasoline-powered internal combustion engine car from remote, then China can certainly stop electric vehicles from remote. And what you see in Europe is these Chinese vehicles hollowing out the auto industry. In 2025, BYD, it's called Build Your Dreams, it's the largest Chinese auto manufacturer, is going to be selling a car called the Seagull for 11,500 euros. That's about $12,000 in Germany. And it's a nice car. It's not a tinny car. It doesn't look like a golf cart. It's a four-door sedan. And when GM's Ford CEO Jim Farley went over to look at it, he was really shocked. He didn't think it was going to be as nice as it is. And Europe is hollowing out its industrial sector through its net zero rules. We don't want to be doing the same. We've heard a lot about climate and the importance of climate, the importance of reducing carbon emissions. But if the United States and Europe stop using carbon or fossil fuels right now, it would only make a difference of 0.3 degrees centigrade by the year 2100, according to government models. That's because other areas of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, they are continuing to increase their carbon emissions. China is building a couple of coal-fired power plants a week. Russia is increasing. Iran is increasing. There's 3 to 6 billion people in the global south, that's Latin America and Africa, who don't have running water and electricity. And they want to have fossil fuels so that they can have reliable electricity and running water. Countries like Indonesia, they have electricity and running water, but they all want air conditioning. It's hot in Indonesia. I don't know if you've ever visited, but they all want air conditioning. That means more fossil fuels. So if the United States and Europe decarbonize, but the rest of the world doesn't, it doesn't have any effect on the climate, and that's according to government models. So let's get to Pennsylvania. That's my third handout. And uses of renewables are making rates double. They're making rates go up very, very sharply. This op-ed is by my colleague Mario Loyola. It was published yesterday in National Review, right in time for me to present it today. And it's about how Pennsylvania's power grid faces crisis under Biden-Harris policies. And I'd like to read one paragraph from it, and it talks about how PJM is dealing with electricity production. And according to PJM, quote, renewable generation represented as much as 118% of the PJM load, and as little as 3% of the PJM load. So this means, unquote, this means that even when the grid has 30% or 50% renewables, grid operators will still have to find enough non-renewable power to supply 97% of grid requirements. Basically, this means that if all of a sudden your wind turbines stop working, you don't have solar power, PJM, the regional transmission operator, is still responsible for getting power to all of you. So it has to have enough baseload power to be able to provide that. And that's what makes it really expensive, that you have renewables, but they don't work all the time. So your capacity with your natural gas power plant, your baseload power, that's sitting idle a lot of the time. And that is also expensive. PJM says that 58 gigawatts, 20% of its capacity is going to be closed by 2030. And that's a bit like closing 50 nuclear power plants. And the tax incentives for wind and solar are basically pushing your baseload power out. No one is going to invest in a new natural gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant if there's all these incentives to invest in wind and solar. So you have these nice graphs about clean energy investment going up. Yes, it's going up, but it's not lowering our price of electricity. And that's what all of us are concerned about. We saw these graphs yesterday from the Commonwealth Foundation, all the polls, and all the polls were saying people are worried about high inflation. People are worried about high electricity costs. So the investment in clean energy is going to make that worse rather than better. So we also heard about how Google and Microsoft, they're getting their own centers to generate electricity for their data centers. So Microsoft had Constellation to open the 3 Mile Island plant, and there are other data centers you see that are setting up their own data centers. Other big AI groups and other Microsoft, Google, Amazon. We don't want to be getting to the situation where these companies have basically a lock on energy. So they need the energy, so they're buying it for themselves. But what about all of us? It's a bit like people who have generators. Okay, the power goes up, they have generators, they don't care. But what about those of us who don't have generators? And also it's kind of layering on excess capacity on excess capacity. You don't want Microsoft and Google have to buy their own energy supply. You want to have reliable energy supply for you. You don't want to have the extra layer of having all these generators. I mean, that's expensive. It's much better to have reliable energy and electricity for everybody. So just to get to a couple, I just want to show you 2 slides very quickly to show you the benefit that natural gas and oil have had to Pennsylvania on the Marcellus Shale. So here we have the Marcellus Shale. All of us can recognize where it is. We're up at the top on the left over here, and then the Marcellus Shale is above the state line in New York. Next slide, please. So here's the Twin Tiers. The Twin Tiers are those areas that produce oil and natural gas extensively. Pennsylvania, here, we have used those. In New York, there's a law against fracking. So New York has not used its share of the Marcellus Shale. Next slide. So here we have mining, quarrying oil and natural gas employment. And we can see that in 2010, when fracking started, the orange line is New York. The blue line is Pennsylvania. It went up very sharply in Pennsylvania. It didn't go up in New York. Next slide. Here's real GDP per capita in Pennsylvania and New York Marcellus Shale counties. So what I did was I took the Marcellus Shale counties, I looked at GDP per capita. You see 2010 in those counties, all the Marcellus Shale counties, Pennsylvania is way ahead of New York. And here's my final slide, because you've seen a lot of slides. I don't want to bore you with slides. Next slide. So this is just in the Twin Tier counties. That third slide that you saw where it was the counties where there was intensive oil and natural gas exploration. Pennsylvania has got even further ahead than New York. So where there's a lot of oil and natural gas extraction, the economy does really well. So Pennsylvania has done really well compared with New York State. And we need more of that investment. It's better for us, it lowers electricity prices, and it means we are not dependent on China. And that's why the IRA is an oxymoron. It's not the Inflation Reduction Act. It raises inflation and it reduces our economic strength. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, and I think this is certainly an excellent opportunity for dialogue. I would say that that was a very interesting set of presentations. So I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. We've heard a lot of information. This particular set of presentations, and I think what we're talking about now, is really highlighting the emerging and growing tension between climate objectives and emission objectives, affordability, local economies. It's a really difficult problem to grapple with and solve. So does anyone in the audience have any questions for our panelists? Yes, ma'am. Brenda, do we need to bring mics over?
Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So good morning, Brenda Schaefer, U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. The question to all of you, the friends who want to take it, I'm switching to the task microphone as well. So we see that in dollar terms, investments in low carbon energy is higher than in fossil fuels, but that each dollar generates, as far as I understand, less BTU, meaning that you're investing more dollars, but there's something a bit misleading because you're creating less energy. How do you see that ever changing? What do you see as the trajectories for energy security if that's true?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that question. So the wind blows for free, the sun shines for free, but connecting it with the electric grid can be very difficult. And there are cases where solar power, for example, lowers electricity costs. You see in some countries that they have little solar panels on the roof that heat their water. That would reduce their electricity costs. But the whole process of connecting it to the grid, and people often be able to sell it to the grid for a certain amount, that basically raises the cost of producing that electricity. Over the past 20 years, the world has spent $9 trillion, that's trillion dollars, on subsidies for wind and solar. It still cannot stand on its own without any tax credits. I think that tells us something.
Brenda, the energy density of fossil energy is obviously very well known, and I think that if we weren't addressing, and it's something that I feel is very present in global dialogue, we certainly saw that in Dubai at COP28, which global climate change conversations are happening. If we weren't dealing for negative externalities of climate, I do think you would watch us continuing to proliferate just the use of fossil energy. There are, however, negative externalities that the world's grappling with. Now, some of those, and I tried to make this point in the last statement, which is some of those come face to face with other incentives that countries have to take out and take away a competitive advantage that the United States has, which is an abundance of fossil energy. So we have to be smart in how we use it now, and I think one thing that we should really emphasize, there's an extreme temporal element in this. So using fossil energy right now is a very prudent move for the United States, and it is a very prudent move for the global economy because we need to have that level of stability. That doesn't mean that the rest of the world isn't going to move on to other technologies and explore other technologies because of other facets that we have to grapple with. And so what I envision and where I would like to be on the back end of a net zero 2050 scenario is that the United States is as secure and as competitive then as we are today. If we don't do that right, I think that we have to grapple a little bit more intimately with what climate change means for us. And so whatever the outcome is of how we deploy our energy assets, they should be leveraged with that trajectory in mind.
RJ, would you like to add anything? Right, other questions? So, yes, we have several now. Please, in the back.
To whomever choose to respond, there's a school of thinking that the negative externalities of climate change don't in fact exist, that in fact atmospheric carbon dioxide produces a net positive in terms of greening the earth, increasing crop production, for example.
Yeah, I would agree that there's a school of thought on that, and Dan, I don't know if you want to add more. There's certainly a school of thought on that. I would not call that the predominant thought of global dialogue, right? And so as we look to make sure America is competitive in whichever circumstance develops in terms of economic growth in the future of how people are competing, that's not inhibiting countries from setting up, for example, trade mechanisms based on the predominant thinking around climate change. And so we have to be competitive in a world whether the science proves ultimately to be different than where it's generally the general trajectory is right now. I think that we have to be prepared for people to respond to the dominant narrative is how I respond to that. And so we need to make sure the United States maintains its competitiveness. I do think natural gas in regions like that, like this, play a really key role in doing that.
Next
Yeah,
question.
there's a
I'm
paper.
sorry.
Yeah, there's a paper by Susan Crockford, Crockford, on the Hudson Institute website. It was just completed on how agriculture does do better in warm weather. There's also a lot of evidence that people are healthier in warm weather. More people die in the winter in cold months than in warm months. But just getting to the practical aspect, we hear a lot about how the social cost of carbon is high, and how damaging carbon is. But there are places in the world where the social cost of carbon is negative. In other words, where if there were more carbon emissions, people would be healthier. And I'm referring to countries in Africa, Latin America that don't have electricity and running water Imagine you're in a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You don't have any electricity and running water. But then someone started a natural gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant. And these days, modern coal-fired power plants have scrubbers. They are relatively clean. And everybody had electricity and running water. I mean, that thought experiment would show you that people would be healthier in that circumstance than without the electricity and running water. So certain carbon emissions make people healthier, and we see a migration of people from the global south to the north. People are leaving Africa, these areas with less carbon emissions, less fossil fuels, to the industrialized levels, countries in Europe. They're leaving Latin America to go to the United States. Why? Because fossil fuels create low electricity. Low electricity attracts manufacturing. Manufacturing creates jobs, and it enables us to have a prosperous life. So there's vast benefits to fossil fuels that I think a lot of people don't quite see. I mean, young people, they love to charge their phones. They can't imagine being without their phone every single second of the day. But they think that the ways of charging it are nasty and dirty. They like to have lights. They like to have air conditioning. But they seem to look down on the inexpensive ways that allow them to have the lifestyle that they have. Now, I come from England, where heated bathrooms were a luxury, where you basically often cannot get a live refrigerator, you cannot get a high-pressure hot shower. I appreciate all these little things very much. But I think there's a lot of benefits to fossil fuels that people here should appreciate also.
Thank you. We are running tight on time. I think we're going to have to take one more question, and that's going to be it.
We saw the Commonwealth Foundation's poll numbers yesterday. How do we square all this up with an electorate that wants electricity and wants gasoline and doesn't want to pay more for renewable resources?
Panelists.
Well, poverty is a problem that's with us now. Climate change is a risk in the future that has to be managed. And a lot of people are concerned, as we saw from the Commonwealth poll study, with their expenses right now. And I think that you can see also with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, reducing poverty is goal number 1. Climate change is goal number 13. So I think we have to get our priorities straight. And we have to think about how do we make people better off. And we have to think about adaptation also. Having more air conditioners, having better insulated homes. And we need to look at other solutions to climate change. There's a book by Steve Koonin, who was a Undersecretary of Energy under President Obama, who wrote a book called Unsettled. And he suggests a whole variety of ways of adapting to slightly warmer temperatures that we should be considering in the light that Asia, Africa, Latin America, much of the rest of the world is not going to be following Europe and the United States on this path of decarbonization.
Okay, I've been told we have an opportunity for one last question. So, and we do need to make it quick, but we do have space for one more.
There we go. There's been a lot of talk about externalities. So one externality I'd like to ask a question about is one, land use, and the other replacement of actual megawatts. So for example, one externality in land use we talked about PJM and what they need to replace. If PJM wanted to power their entire grid with renewables, let's just say solar for example, you'd have to cover the entire state of Delaware with solar panels, and then either half of the state of Maryland or half of the state of New Jersey, pick which one you want to see people displaced. But we would have that's the amount of land use you would have to cover with just solar, because 1 gigawatt of solar is about 15.5 square miles versus 1 gigawatt of nuclear is 1 square mile. So I would just like a question for the panel: what do we see about if we care about the environment? What do we see about the externalities of land use with renewables versus something like nuclear? For example, and then if you could just speak briefly about the replacement of those 58 gigawatts, what that looks like, because I would imagine that those gigawatts coming offline are baseload and dispatchable, and what's in the queue is intermittent and not baseload, not dispatchable.
We have 2 minutes for a response.
Yeah, I don't think there's any real scenario where the U.S. goes to an all renewables model. Like I don't think anyone's really advocating for that. Maybe a few, but I think what we're looking at more likely is some combination, and this is the longer term for the Michael Cohen analysis. Yes, we'll have lots of wind and solar and variable resources, but we'll have nuclear and probably have gas with CCUS. Right, like if I had events from post 2040, that would probably be a scenario that you would look at. In terms of land use for solar, I agree with you. I think that countries like the US have a huge advantage in terms of the land that we have available. It's not going to fly as easily in places like Japan, right? So they also will need resources like nuclear and gas with CCUS for base load and also for land management reasons. So I think it's like looking at decarbonized power sources for base load, and then yes, significant growth in batteries and solar and wind as well. But I don't see the sort of all renewables pathway as being too likely for some of the reasons you mentioned.
I think to get to also another facet of your question, this raises the price of agriculture. It raises the price of food. And energy security is tied to food security. And we see this in Europe, where there are riots by farmers because they're being told that they could only have one animal per hectare, or because subsidies for diesel are getting taken away. They can see these food prices going up. We can see it in other areas where lack of electricity means you cannot have refrigeration. So say you're in South Africa and you're a small business owner and you get a power cut, all of a sudden you have to have a fire sale of all your frozen chicken, for example, because it's going to go bad. So energy security is vital for food security, and in the Netherlands there have been right-wing parties elected partly because of the unhappiness over these new farming policies.
So Diane, thank you, Diane. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we do have to move on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in